A woman tried to set firm boundaries with her neighbor, but when others from the building took her side, the confrontation became more than anyone anticipated. Maya Henderson unlocked the door to her apartment with a weary sigh, the weight of a long workday evident in her slumped shoulders. The small one-bedroom unit wasn't much, but after 14 months of saving and sacrificing, it represented something precious: independence. She placed her keys in the ceramic bowl by the entryway, kicked off her shoes, and turned on the soft lamp that bathed the living room in a warm glow. Friday nights were sacred to her, a ritual of self-care after long weeks of client meetings and project deadlines. With takeout ordered and a documentary queued up on her laptop, Maya settled onto her couch, the familiar cushions conforming to her frame. She had carefully cultivated this atmosphere, the vanilla candle flickering on the coffee table, the string lights draped across her bookshelf, and the blessed, beautiful silence that surrounded her. The building was generally quiet, one of the main reasons she had chosen it, with most residents respecting the unspoken agreement of reasonable noise levels, especially in the evenings. She had just taken her first bite of pad thai when the music started. At first, it was just a distant thump, barely noticeable above her documentary. But within minutes, the bass intensified, vibrating through the shared wall between her apartment and her neighbors. Maya closed her eyes and counted to 10, hoping it might stop on its own. Didn't. After 20 minutes of increasing volume, she stood up, smoothed her sweater, and made her way to apartment 4B. The hallway lights flickered as she approached her neighbor's door. She could feel the music now, pulsing through the floorboards, the rhythm of some pop song she vaguely recognized from radio play. Maya knocked firmly, 3 deliberate taps that she hoped conveyed both civility and determination. The door swung open, and there stood Daniel Warner, mid-30s, athletic build, with the easy confidence of someone who rarely heard the word no. His apartment glowed with blue and purple LED lights behind him, illuminating the faces of at least a dozen people. Drinks in hand, conversations paused as they glanced toward the door. "Hey neighbor," he greeted, his smile wide but his eyes assessing, as if trying to determine whether she was a threat to his good time. Maya took a steady breath. "Hi Daniel, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the music is really loud. Would you mind turning it down a bit?" Daniel's smile didn't waver, but something in his eyes hardened, a flash of annoyance quickly masked by practiced charm. "It's Friday night," he said, leaning against the doorframe, his voice carrying the slight condescension of someone explaining something obvious. "Everyone's just unwinding after the work week. It's barely 10 o'clock. Maya felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation she always got when someone dismissed her reasonable request as unreasonable. She understood perfectly well that Daniel Warner, with his expensive watch and carefully curated apartment filled with friends, operated under different social rules than most. Rules that prioritized his enjoyment over others' comfort, that reframed consideration as unnecessary restriction. She kept her voice steady, determined not to be bulldozed. "I understand it's Friday, but the building has noise regulations regardless of the day. I can feel the bass through my walls." Daniel's smile faded slightly, replaced with an expression of mild disbelief. "Seriously? It's not even that loud. We're just having a few friends over." Maya resisted the urge to look past him at the few friends that clearly numbered into double digits. She knew what he was doing, minimizing her concerns, making her out to be overly sensitive, difficult. "Look," Daniel continued, his voice rising just enough to carry to those nearest the door, another calculated move designed to frame her as the problem. "This is city living. If you want complete silence, maybe an apartment building isn't for you." The comment hung in the air, a direct challenge wrapped in casual cruelty. A few of his guests shifted uncomfortably, while others exchanged glances. Maya felt heat rise to her face, the familiar burn of being put on the spot, of being made to feel unreasonable for requesting basic courtesy. But before she could respond, Someone else stepped into the hallway, and what happened next would change the entire dynamic of the evening. Mrs. Abernathy from 4A appeared beside them, her silver hair swept into a neat bun, her cardigan buttoned precisely to her collar. At 72, Eleanor Abernathy had lived in the building longer than most residents had been alive, her sharp eyes and sharper wit making her both respected and slightly feared by neighbors and building management alike. "Everything all right out here?" she asked, her voice carrying the authority of someone who didn't need to raise it to be heard. Before Maya could speak, Daniel jumped in, his posture straightening slightly in the older woman's presence. "Just a small disagreement about noise levels," he explained, his tone softening to something almost deferential. "Nothing serious." Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows rose slightly, her gaze traveling from Daniel to the apartment behind him, taking in the scene with practiced efficiency. "Small disagreement," she repeated, not as a question but as an assessment. "Young man, I can hear your music from my bedroom, and I'm partially deaf in my left ear." Maya watched Mrs. Abernathy closely, uncertain whether the older woman was there to help or simply investigate the disturbance. Her eyes moved to Maya. "You've asked him to turn it down?" Maya nodded. "Yes, just now." Mrs. Abernathy turned back to Daniel. "Well then, that should settle it, shouldn't it?" Daniel sighed, the sound laced with frustration. "With all due respect, Mrs. Abernathy, it's Friday night. People are allowed to have gatherings." The older woman didn't blink. "People are allowed to have reasonable gatherings that don't disturb the entire floor. The lease agreement is quite clear on that point." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he wasn't ready to back down so easily. "This is getting ridiculous," he said, his voice rising just enough to draw attention from people passing in the hallway. "It's like we're living in a retirement home instead of a downtown apartment building. What's next? Complaints about cooking smells." The way he said it, deliberately loud enough for others to hear, sent a wave of frustration through Maya. He was trying to make this about unreasonable neighbors rather than his own inconsideration. Mrs. Abernathy, however, remained unmoved by his theatrics. "The building has rules, Mr. Warner. They apply regardless of the day of the week or your personal feelings about them." Daniel's face flushed slightly. He turned to Maya, his gaze hardening. "Is this really necessary? Calling in reinforcements over a little music?" Maya met his stare, her voice even but firm. "I didn't call anyone. I just asked you to turn down the volume." Daniel let out a short, dismissive laugh, glancing around as if seeking support from invisible observers. "2 against 1, huh? Nice strategy." The comment was petty, childish even, but that was exactly how men like Daniel operated when challenged. They tried to reframe reasonable boundaries as personal attacks. Maya felt uncomfortably aware of the growing audience. A couple returning from dinner had paused near the elevator, pretending not to watch. 2 more residents stood a few doors down, whispering. This was exactly what she had wanted to avoid. A public confrontation, becoming that neighbor who complained, who caused scenes. She could feel her resolve wavering, the pressure to just let it go, to retreat to her apartment and endure the noise rather than stand her ground. But why was it always on her to compromise? Why did people like Daniel get to ignore rules without consequences? Mrs. Abernathy must have sensed her internal struggle because she stepped closer to Maya, a subtle yet clear show of solidarity. "Mr. Warner," she said, her voice carrying a note of finality, "either turn down the music now or I'll be happy to call building security." Daniel exhaled sharply, nostrils flaring, and then he muttered something under his breath. Maya didn't catch most of it, but she heard uptight and typical. Her stomach tightened. Mrs. Abernathy's entire demeanor changed instantly. Her back straightened, her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the hallway seemed to go completely still. The tension was palpable, heavy in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. Maya's pulse quickened, her hands instinctively curling into loose fists at her sides. She had heard enough coded language in her life to recognize it instantly, and so had Mrs. Abernathy. The older woman's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze fixed on Daniel with newfound intensity. "I'd suggest you choose your next words very carefully, young man," she said, her voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. The energy in the hallway shifted, the whispers growing more urgent. But before anyone could say anything else, another voice joined the conversation. "Is there a problem here?" A deep voice cut through the tension. All heads turned toward Jason Chen, the tenant from 4D who served on the building's resident council. He stood a few feet away, grocery bags in hand, his expression concerned but composed. Maya had spoken with him only a few times at building meetings, but she knew his reputation for fairness and level-headedness. He wasn't looking at Daniel or Maya but at Mrs. Abernathy, as if deferring to her assessment of the situation. The older woman nodded slightly in acknowledgement. "Mr. Warner was just about to turn down his music," she said, her focus still fixed on Daniel. "Weren't you?" Jason set his groceries down, his movement deliberate, unhurried. "The noise complaint policy is pretty clear," he said, addressing no one in particular. "First warning is informal, second is documented, third results in fines." Daniel's frustration was visible now, his composure cracking under the pressure of multiple confrontations. "This is absurd," he said, gesturing around at the small crowd that had gathered. "Are we really doing this over some background music at a get-together?" No one responded immediately, and that silence seemed to fuel his indignation. "This is what's wrong with buildings nowadays," he continued, his voice carrying down the hallway. "Everyone's so quick to complain instead of just talking to each other like adults." The irony of his statement, given that Maya had done exactly that, wasn't lost on anyone present. Maya felt a surge of irritation rise in her chest, not just at his words but at the blatant attempt to rewrite what had just happened, to cast himself as the reasonable party despite all evidence to the contrary. She took a steadying breath. "I did talk to you," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "That's why we're having this conversation right now." The man from 4D, Jason, nodded slightly, as if satisfied with her response. Daniel, however, was far from satisfied. "Whatever," he muttered, his frustration clearly mounting. "This whole thing is an overreaction." A woman stepping off the elevator, keys in hand, paused as she approached the growing cluster of people. She assessed the situation quickly, then spoke up unexpectedly. "The walls in this building are pretty thin," she said matter-of-factly. "If multiple people can hear your music, it's definitely too loud." Daniel turned toward her, his frustration shifting targets. "It's a Friday night social gathering," he repeated, as if this magic phrase should automatically grant him immunity from consideration. "Are we not allowed to have fun anymore?" The woman raised an eyebrow. "Fun doesn't have to involve disturbing everyone else on the floor." Maya exhaled quietly, surprised and somewhat relieved by the unexpected support. More residents had gathered now, some looking irritated, others simply curious about the commotion. The momentum was shifting, and Daniel could feel it. His confident stance faltered slightly, his arguments sounding increasingly hollow against the collective disapproval. But before he could respond, Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward. "This has gone on long enough," she said firmly. "Turn the music down now, or we'll escalate this to management." Daniel hesitated, clearly calculating his options, weighing his pride against the mounting pressure. Finally, he turned to Maya, his voice lower but still barbed with resentment. "Fine," he said. "Keep the building quiet and boring. That's just great." The words were meant to sting, to make her feel small and unreasonable, but they fell flat in the face of the collective support around her. Maya didn't respond, knowing anything she said would only prolong the confrontation. Mrs. Abernathy, however, had reached her limit. "That's quite enough," she said, her tone sharp with authority. "Mr. Warner, inside. Now." For a moment, Daniel looked like he might argue further, his jaw set, shoulders tense. But then something shifted in his expression. The realization, perhaps, that he had pushed too far, that what should have been a simple noise complaint had escalated into something much more significant. He had misjudged not just Maya, but the entire floor's tolerance for his behavior. The balance of power had tipped, and not in his favor. But men like Daniel Warmer, they didn't surrender easily, even when outmaneuvered. "You want me to go inside?" he repeated, his voice quieter now, testing boundaries one last time. "Yes," Mrs. Abernathy said without hesitation. "And turn that music down immediately." Maya watched the calculation happening in real time, the way Daniel's mind worked through his options, the growing awareness that he was dangerously close to turning a simple noise complaint into a documented lease violation. He knew he was losing, but instead of gracefully accepting defeat, he played his final card. "I just think it's interesting," he said, raising his voice again to ensure everyone heard, "that when I have friends over, it's a problem, but when other people have gatherings, no one says a word. Seems selective to me." The implication hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Maya felt her stomach twist with anger, but she remained silent, refusing to engage with such a transparent attempt at deflection. Mrs. Abernathy, however, had run out of patience. "That's enough," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "One more word along those lines, and I'll be contacting management tonight, not tomorrow." The murmurs in the hallway grew louder, residents exchanging glances, some shifting uncomfortably, others watching with undisguised interest. Daniel seemed to realize, perhaps for the first time, that there might be real consequences to his behavior. He glanced toward the elevator, as if measuring how quickly the news of this confrontation would spread throughout the building, how it might affect his standing with neighbors and management alike. And then another figure appeared, Mark Petrowski, the building's maintenance supervisor who lived on the first floor, his ring of master keys jangling at his belt as he approached. "Everything okay up here?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of semi-official authority. "Got a call about some kind of disturbance." Mrs. Abernathy didn't break eye contact with Daniel. "Just a noise complaint that's taking longer to resolve than it should," she said. Mark's expression remained neutral, but his presence added another layer of pressure to the situation. This wasn't just between neighbors anymore. Now it involved building staff, which meant reports, documentation, potentially even lease reviews. Maya could see the exact moment Daniel realized he had lost completely. The slight slump of his shoulders, the tight set of his jaw. He wasn't surrendering gracefully, but he was surrendering. "Fine," he muttered. Then, without another word, he turned and stepped back into his apartment, the door closing with more force than necessary behind him. Almost immediately, the volume of the music decreased significantly. A collective sense of relief seemed to wash over the gathered neighbors. Mark waited a moment, then nodded once. "All good." Mrs. Abernathy gave him a small smile. "All resolved, thank you, Mark." As the small crowd began to disperse, a woman from across the hall caught Maya's attention. "Good for you for speaking up," she said quietly, offering an encouraging smile. Maya nodded, not quite sure how to respond. The encounter had left her feeling drained yet somehow vindicated. The hallway emptied gradually, residents returning to their apartments with new gossip to discuss. Mrs. Abernathy turned to Maya. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her stern demeanor softening slightly. Maya let out a breath that was part sigh, part nervous laughter. "Yes, I think so." But truthfully, she wasn't entirely sure how she felt. There had been a moment, a real, undeniable moment, when she had considered just letting it go, retreating to her apartment and enduring the noise rather than standing her ground. She had almost given in to that familiar pressure, the unspoken expectation that she should accommodate, compromise, make things easier for everyone else. But she hadn't, and now, despite the confrontation, despite the tension that still lingered in the air, there was something almost liberating about it. Mrs. Abernathy patted her arm gently. "Don't let it trouble you," she said, as if reading Maya's thoughts. "You had every right to ask for reasonable quiet." Maya nodded, adjusting her sweater. "Thank you for stepping in," she said. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "We've all been dealing with Daniel Warner's parties for months. Someone needed to say something." As they parted ways, Maya returning to her apartment, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the situation was resolved, lingering anxiety about potential awkward encounters in the future, but underneath it all, a quiet satisfaction. She had set a boundary and held it, even when it would have been easier to back down. Just as she was settling back onto her couch, however, her phone pinged with a notification. It was a building-wide message board alert, and what she saw made her stomach drop. Daniel had posted something, a vague complaint about certain residents being impossible to please and ruining the community atmosphere. He hadn't named her directly, but the timing made it unmistakably clear who he was referring to. Maya's pulse quickened, her hands suddenly cold. What was he doing? The message thread quickly filled with responses, most of them confused or asking for context. A knock at her door startled her. When she opened it, she found Mrs. Abernathy standing there, phone in hand, expression grim. "Have you seen this?" she asked without preamble. Maya nodded, stepping aside to let the older woman in. "He's trying to turn this around," she said, her voice tight with frustration. Mrs. Abernathy scrolled through the responses, then looked up at Maya with unexpected determination. "Well, we're not going to let him, are we?" Before Maya could respond, Mrs. Abernathy had already begun typing. Her response was concise, factual, and devastating in its simplicity. For those unaware of context, this post follows a noise complaint about music that could be heard through multiple apartments at nearly 11 p.m. Building policy is clear on noise levels after 10 p.m. No one is ruining community atmosphere by requesting compliance with agreed-upon rules. Maya read over her shoulder, heart racing. This wasn't just about noise anymore, it was about narrative control, about who got to define what had happened tonight. Within minutes, other responses flooded in. The woman who had stepped off the elevator added her perspective. Jason from the resident council clarified the noise policy. Even Mark, the maintenance supervisor, weighed in with a gentle reminder about community standards. Maya watched in real time as Daniel's attempt to vilify her backfired completely. The collective response was clear. The problem wasn't Maya's reasonable request. It was Daniel's unreasonable reaction to being asked to follow the rules. Mrs. Abernathy lowered her phone with a satisfied nod. "There," she said simply. "That should settle it." Maya let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for the relief she felt. Mrs. Abernathy waved away her thanks. "Community means looking out for each other," she said, "and sometimes that means standing up to the Daniel Warners of the world." Just as she was about to leave, Maya's phone pinged again. Another building-wide alert, but this time from management. The message was brief but clear. Reminder that the building message board is for community announcements and positive engagement. Personal disputes should be addressed privately. Recent posts have been archived. Thank you for your cooperation. And just like that, Daniel's attempt to control the narrative was erased, leaving only the truth of what had happened. Mrs. Abernathy chuckled softly. "Well, that's that," she said. The tension in the room dissipated, replaced by something lighter, almost triumphant. As Mrs. Abernathy left, Maya returned to her couch, her documentary still paused on her laptop screen. The building felt quieter now, peaceful in a way that went beyond just the absence of thumping bass. She reached for her takeout, now cold but still appealing, and pressed play on her film. In the apartment above hers, someone was walking around, soft, considerate footsteps that barely registered. Across the hall, the faint sound of a television at a reasonable volume. These were the normal sounds of apartment living, the ambient noise of shared existence. Maya took a bite of her pad thai, settling deeper into her cushions. There was something profound in what had happened tonight, something beyond a simple noise complaint. It was about respect, about community standards, about the small negotiations that make shared living possible. Daniel had treated those standards as optional, as less important than his own desires, and when challenged, He had tried to make Maya the villain for simply asking him to consider others. It should never have escalated to the point it did. A seat at the table, a reasonable noise level, basic courtesy. These weren't extravagant demands. They were the fundamental building blocks of community living. Yet because one person refused to acknowledge them as valid, what should have been a simple request had turned into a floor-wide incident. Maya sighed, letting the documentary wash over her. She wasn't proud of the confrontation, wasn't celebrating Daniel's public rebuke, but she didn't regret standing her ground either. The next morning, as she stepped into the hallway with her recycling, she encountered several neighbors. Some nodded knowingly, others offered small smiles of solidarity. The woman from the elevator stopped her directly. "Last night was something else," she said, shaking her head. Daniel needed that reality check. A man coming up the stairs chuckled in agreement. Been waiting for someone to call him out for months. Maya didn't quite know how to respond, so she just nodded, a small acknowledgement of their shared experience. As she headed back to her apartment, she passed Daniel's door. She tensed slightly, preparing for an awkward encounter, but the hallway remained empty. Part of her wondered if she should feel guilty, if she had somehow overreacted or caused unnecessary drama. But then she remembered how quickly he had tried to make her the problem, how readily he had escalated what should have been a simple exchange. No, she hadn't been wrong to stand her ground, to expect basic consideration, to hold firm when pressured to give in. Because this story isn't just about a neighbor who played his music too loud. It's about entitlement, about the assumption that rules apply differently to different people, about how some individuals will do anything to avoid accommodating others. And for people like Maya, setting boundaries, holding firm, refusing to be intimidated or shamed into silence, these aren't acts of hostility. They're necessary assertions of mutual respect in shared spaces. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply ask for what you're already entitled to, and refuse to back down when met with resistance. If you've ever experienced something like this, or if you've witnessed someone being pressured to accept unreasonable behavior, I want to hear about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe for more, because trust me, there's always more to talk about.